You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 160. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
I was doing it not because I wanted any recognition. It was because I just wanted to help these kids. I understood my why. And it didn't matter to me what I did. I just wanted to help them. And so I think when you deeply understand your why, it frees you up and it releases you from all the personal kind of things that we struggle with sometimes.
You'll hear in this conversation with Bill Lyle that we recorded this episode back in December. Since then, there have been significant unsettling events that have unfolded in our city and our country, not to mention our world. We've broken records for over 4,000 deaths in one day from COVID, even as we're on record pace to provide a vaccine to fight against COVID. Over 374,000 people have died from COVID. And just last week, a breach of the U.S. Capitol where violence and hatred sought to undermine the foundation of our nation. Now, because I've just said that, if you're saying to yourself, Sarah, this isn't a health or a political podcast, what I want you to hear me say is this is a leadership podcast. And one aspect of courageous leadership is having a pulse on the events in our context and in our surroundings. Additionally, the topic of our conversation today is what's your why? So as you listen to Bill's wisdom and his stories, I hope you'll consider your why. How is it informing and influencing every decision you make? And I mean every decision you make as a leader who follows Jesus. Whether it's in the church, in your home, in your participation in our democracy, and yes, in taking care of your health and the health of others. Knowing and understanding your why and making decisions connected to your why will help you have clarity, will help you respond, and will help you continue to be the person that God created you to be. Once again, you can find show notes on the podcast page at transformingmission.org/podcast. You can also go directly to this episode and find the show notes there at transformingmission.org/160. Without any further wait, here is our conversation with Bill Lyle.
Well, Bill, welcome to LeaderCast.
Well, thanks for having me join you guys.
So people would know who you are and what you get paid to do. Would you tell us who you are and what you get paid to do?
So before I do that, let me just tell you what a privilege it is to be with you guys today. I know we're going to be talking about our whys and courageous leadership. And I just want to say, you sent out a letter or an email, Tim, to the churches in the end of November, December about asking them to close down. And that was a courageous move. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about both of you is your courageous leadership in the midst of this conversation that we're having. So who am I? Well, I'm Bill Lyle. And first and foremost, I would say I am a follower of Jesus. I'm a husband. My wife and I have been married for 35 years. And I have two grown daughters. They're awesome. I am a pastor at Peace United Methodist Church in the Capital Area South District, and I have been an elder for 30 years in the United Methodist Church. So, and what do I get paid to do? That's a great question. Well, I would say I get paid to lead the church in the mission of Jesus. That's probably, if I had to narrow it down into one thing, I would say that's probably what it is. I try to encourage and challenge and inspire people. I get paid to help Jesus extend his kingdom into this world. And so I love doing it. I love helping people discover their purpose in life. I love helping people discover a relationship with Jesus and be able to grow in that. And so I guess I get paid to do all that.
That sounds great. Let me.
I'm thinking that other duties as assigned is what where you might spend all of your time. I'm just kidding, but that it's all of the intangible things that we don't think about in the work that we do, and you've named all of them. So thank you.
I was just going to say it's even tougher now, in the midst of COVID. It's like we're having to relearn everything. So it makes it even harder.
Well, that may be a context for the next question, and that what does being a courageous leader mean to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it means trying to make the best decision that you can based on the information that you currently have, even in the midst of a hard situation that you have to face. It's not the absence of fear or worry or anxiety, but it's being able to move forward even when you feel like you're paralyzed. You still move forward and you do the best that you can. And I think that's courage in my mind.
Yeah, one of the things that I've learned is that fear really paralyzes us.
Yeah.
So to be that courageous leader in the midst of fear, you just said you're able to make decisions to move forward.
Yeah.
Can I geek out here for a moment?
Sure.
Around the research around courageous leadership.
Uh-huh.
That was what Brené Brown expected to find when she was doing her research around what makes up a courageous leader, is that it was someone who didn't have fear. And instead, what she found was that courageous leaders all are able to name that they are afraid, and they continue to act. And so you just confirmed the research, Bill. So,
well, I'll tell you, it's interesting because our church, in the end of November, we decided to resuspend our in-person worship. And we were having a conversation with our leadership board. And the board, had brought some, kind of data to the table. We have a guy that works fairly high up in Ohio Health, and he had some information on the hospitals. But the board had said to me, Bill, this is your decision. I realized, and I decided it was based on the information and the conversation that we had, that we really needed to resuspend our worship services through the end of December and possibly even into January and February. And that was a really hard decision. I got away from that board meeting and I just felt exhausted. And I didn't realize how emotionally exhausting that decision was for me in that moment. But you still have to move forward even in the midst of that.
That is courage. And one of the things, Bill, you're going to help us do as we have entered this new year, that each month in 2021, we're focusing on a different theme for courageous leaders. We've already started that conversation with you. The question we're asking is, what do courageous leaders need to know, do, or understand? And one of the things that we've said that courageous leaders, or we've discovered that courageous leaders need to understand, is how to live out their purpose. So for those who are listening, January's big theme is purpose. And for our conversation today, we'd like to focus on how, Bill, you lead the church that you're a part of and how you live your life to stay focused on your purpose. And we've done some talking and do lots of talking because we believe what Simon Sinek has talked about, to know your why, or to start with why. So we want to continue the conversation with that in mind.
Well, it's interesting because I first got acquainted with Simon Sinek a couple years ago when I watched his TED Talk on, the circles. And you start with your why, and then you have the how and the what. And when I first watched that, it was hard for me because I'd always interpreted the why kind of as the mission of the church. But as I kind of studied it a little bit more and worked through it, I began to realize it was more, the why was more about the motivation of why you do what you do. And it's not really the mission of the church, because I kept starting with the mission thinking, well, that was the why, but I realized it really wasn't. And so for me, it was more about understanding what's my motivation behind, why I'm doing what I'm doing. So maybe that leads into your question, Sarah.
It sure does. You know the question I'm going to ask. What's your why?
Well, I think when I was really thinking about this and I was trying to figure it out, I went back to trying to understand it with regard to my motivation, and not even using the word purpose, because purpose started to connect with the mission for me, like what's my mission? And that's really the what question, not the why question. And so the why for me is, why do I do what I do? Why am I a pastor? Why do I want to reach people for Jesus? And as I really prayed about that and thought about this, and this was really came out of a couple years ago, from having listened to that TED Talk, I realized, and that's kind of a pat answer, but it's really true for me, that my why is really because of the gratitude, that absolute gratitude that I have for what God's done for me. And it's a response to that, to that love and grace that God's given to me, is why I'm doing what I'm doing. And so I feel like what I'm kind of trying to do is I'm trying to pay it forward, for what God's done to me, to be able to share that with others. And so that kind of is what motivates me into ministry. And I also connected a little bit to my call. Like, I feel like I've always felt this, that, we have to live out of our call, especially in ministry. And if we don't, then when things get hard and, we go through tough times, if we're relying on maybe some external motivations as opposed to internal intrinsic motivations, then we'll get burned out or stressed out. Not that we don't anyways, but our call is what really drives us. And so it's that gratitude for what God's done for me, and it's that call that kind of connects with my why.
So, Bill, that really resonates with me. So I'm curious. I'm going to ask a question here. Is your why different than the why of Peace United Methodist Church? And if it is, how?
So it's yes and no for me. I think, as I said, I believe our whys are born out of our motivation. And so my personal motivation might be slightly different than the church's motivation, right? But they have to be connected because I'm the leader of the church. And so there's an intricate connection between the two, but I don't believe they absolutely have to be the same. They can be slightly different. They have to be in the same circle, right? The same kind of area, but they might be slightly different. But they overlap a lot as a leader. And the longer I think you're at a church, the more it begins to overlap, because, the influence of the leader tends to influence the direction of the organization. But the question comes down to, for me, is what's God called me to do personally, and what's God called the church to do. And those might be slightly different, but they're probably pretty close.
Would you say, with what you've just said, would you say that it's, I'm leading you with a question here, because I think I understand, but would you say, with what you just said, that it's important that leaders would know themselves as well as the church or the organization that they're leading, and being able to make those connections?
Yeah, I think self-awareness is a huge, important piece of leadership, and that's knowing your strengths and your weaknesses. And it's the same with the church, to be able to be aware of the current reality of the church, and its strengths and weaknesses, and the location, the context that it's in. If you're not aware of those things, you can't. You'll start from the wrong place. And usually when we start from the wrong place, we end up in the wrong place. So I think that self-awareness is critical to leading and to understanding your why and all of that.
So you're leading a church, and your church, you have a staff that you're leading, and everything that you have just named in terms of your why and the church's why, where there is overlap, you also have a team of people who have their own individual whys that are coming into play. So I'm wondering if you can share with us what's essential in leading a team to stay focused on its collective why. So, and yet at the same time, I'm also hearing you acknowledge that our personal whys can't be left at the door because that's our response to God's call. So maybe if you can respond to one of those questions. I think I asked two.
Yeah, so let me back up just a minute before I answer that question and kind of give you like a example of where I kind of sensed my own self-awareness and why I was doing what I was doing. And it's not in the context of the church. It was in the context of I helped to coach a swim team. My older daughter was on a high school swim team, and I had to get up at 4:30 in the morning to get her to practice at 5:15, and I couldn't go home and go back to bed. And so I decided, why don't I just stay and help? And I had swam competitively growing up and swam into college, and I'd coached a few teams and stuff. And so I volunteered to help coach this high school swim team. And the reality is that I actually knew a lot more about swimming than the head coach, and the head coach was getting paid, and I was just volunteering, right? And so,
don't you hate it when that happens?
Yeah, I know. It's like every associate pastor, right? So, and I was one, so I know. I'm speaking out of
you
experience.
Might start meddling there, Bill. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, that was when I was young, and I knew a lot more than the senior pastor. So anyways, I started helping coach this team. Well, the head coach, she put me, and I told her, I said, I just want to help, and I will do whatever you need me to do. And so she put me with the kids that joined the swim team that could not even swim at all. They couldn't even put their face in the water. And so, a lot of them were fearful of even getting in the water. And so I started working with these kids, and, I taught them to blow bubbles and taught them to, kick and all of this. And I absolutely loved it because I was doing it not because I wanted any recognition. It was because I just wanted to help these kids. I understood my why. And it didn't matter to me what I did. I just wanted to help them. And so I think when you deeply understand your why, it frees you up and it releases you from all the personal kind of things that we struggle with sometimes, our temptations for wanting to approval or success or all those kind of things. And so that's another thing I think is really important. So that kind of got us off the track. So back to your question.
No, it didn't get us off the track at all, because what you just said in terms of deeply understanding your why, if we're working with a team of people, and you lead a team of paid and unpaid folks, to stay focused on their why, part of your responsibility is helping them to understand their own why, as well as the organization's why. So I'm wondering if you can share with us what's essential in the midst of that as a leader to help a team stay focused on their why.
So I can tell you some of the things that I've tried to do as I've tried to lead, and I'm learning all the time. Like, I've been in ministry for 30 years, and just when you think you know what you're doing, then everything turns around and you learn some more. So some of the things though that I've learned through the years is that one, obviously you have to be self-aware of your why and the organization's why, but then part of that is that you have to cast that out and you have to recast it and you have to recast it to the point where you just repeat yourself a lot. You say the same things. Maybe you say them in different ways, but you have to say them in your sermons. You have to say them in staff meetings. You say them in committee meetings. You say them in individual conversations that you have with people. And what I found is that the inner circle of my staff that works the closest with me, they actually sometimes get bored with the fact that I repeat over so much, because you just have to do that. If you don't, they start to lose it. And so it's really important to constantly be communicating that over and over again. That's one thing. Another thing I think is, your team has to help own the why of the organization. I think this is what you were talking about, Sarah. They bring their own whys, to the table. And so you have to come up with a why that makes sense to the team. And if it's really God's calling, and this is where I think it's a little different maybe for the church than maybe some, just other organization, we believe our why comes out of our call. And so if that's really true, if God's calling the church to something, then it should be resonating with the other staff, in my mind. When we start to express our whys, it should make sense to all of us, because God called all of us to work together in a team. And so the why should resonate with everyone. And so there has to be kind of this ownership, I think, from the team of the why. And some, they have to be a part of the conversation and the development of it. I also think it's really important to stay streamlined. I like to have a streamlined focus, because and one of the things that we're working at, like at our church, is we're trying to say less is more, because our call, it used to be that we programmed out the gazoo, with ministry. Like we had a program for everything. We thought the more programs we have, the more people we could reach, right? And that was kind of the idea that the church had for a long time. And I think a lot of churches still have that, although COVID is helping us understand that that's not really the case. It's caused us to kind of streamline down. But we had already started having this conversation before COVID, because we felt like our culture is so overloaded with information and stuff that's coming at them. For instance, I think we get more news and more information in a day than people 100 years ago got in a whole year, right? And so people are just over processing, and the church, rather than doing more, has to do less things better. And so we have to and that really comes back down to your why, and what it is that you're really focused in on. And so I think that streamlined focus is helpful for the team, because then you don't have everybody going in 100 different directions. You have, 3 or 4 things that you're really working on. And that also means that we have to say no to things. Certain ministry. Yeah, I know. It's crazy. But and what I found is the best way to say no is to let things die a natural death. And so what I mean by that is we have a ministry in the church, and, it's been going on for 5 or 10 or, 100 years. And the person who's leading it, doesn't want to lead it anymore, or can't, or they die or whatever. Initially our first thought is we just need to replace it. We need to find somebody to do it. And, if there's somebody there that has a passion for it, obviously, you may want to keep it going. But if there's not, we don't try to just keep it going, because what happens is that people start trying to do ministry that's not out of their passion, not out of their why. And then they do it. They don't put the same effort into it. And so the ministry is, it's second rate, and they get tired of doing it because it's not coming out of their own personal motivation. And so I think letting things die and saying no to some ministries that don't fit into your why, don't resurrect Aunt Betty's potluck if Aunt Betty goes away, kind of thing. And we're investing, in those primary ministries. And I feel like it's this, and there's certain ministries, this is the way I kind of conceptualize it in my mind. There's certain ministries that are primary ministries, and those are ministries that if we stop doing them, the church would go away. Like our organization would go away. So now I used to think in-person worship was one of those things that would cause the church to go away, right? I'm changing my mind now about, what those are. But but, and so what I used to say was, if we stop doing church for 6 months, which I'm still saying, if we stop doing church for 6 months, our local church would probably go away. If we didn't offer in-person worship or we didn't offer online worship, that would be really hard for the church to survive through that. But like I said, I used to think it was only in person, but now I'm realizing, no, God's bigger than that. But there are certain things that we have to do that are primary to our existence. And there are only a few things. And everything else is secondary. And so we can't let the primary things die, but we can let the secondary things come and go. And the secondary things come and go based on people's passions and stuff. And I'd say the last thing, well, two more things I'd say about kind of helping the team stay focused on the why and part of it. One is lead by example. We have to lead by example. If you're not living out the why personally as a leader, your team isn't going to. And so they have to see it in you. So that's important too. And the last thing I would say is that it's also really important to tell success stories that help to show the why the why is important. And so we have to tell those stories. So those are some of the things that I do to try to help the team kind of stay focused on the bigger why for us.
So I'm wondering, Bill, if there's a story of why that, as you were thinking about our conversation today, that you've shared recently with maybe your paid staff or the church in general, that you wouldn't mind sharing with our listeners.
That's a really good question, because here's what I think COVID has done. It's really forced me to rethink our why as a church, and also our how and our what, those other circles that Simon Sinek talks about. And the why hasn't changed quite as much. The how and the what have changed significantly with COVID. Things that we thought were really important for us to do as a church, the how, the process, the strategy, the what, the kind of the things that we were known for, what we do, those have changed significantly with COVID. The why hasn't changed as much. So for me, I would say that for a specific story of the why, I would say I don't really have one, because I've continued to share the why the way I have in the past, because that's not changed. What's changed for me with COVID is we've had to drastically rethink our how and our what, because those are changing with COVID. The why hasn't changed so much. We still love people. We still care about people. That's the motivation of why we're reaching out, with God's grace and his love. But how we're doing, how we're doing that, the way we do that has been very different with COVID.
I appreciate you also pointing to the other circles in the start with why, because I think a couple of different things can happen. We can skip over the why and we jump right to how and what, or we get so focused on the why that we never execute on living it out. And part of what I'm hearing you point to is, for now 9 months, as we're recording this episode with you in December, we have all had to learn how to do things differently. And yet keeping that connection to our why and really probing the why and saying, is this really our why? Or have we been missing the mark on that in some way, and being intentional about that, and then asking the question, so what does that mean we're going to do? That whole journey is leadership 101, taking folks from the why to the how to the what. And you have had to do that in warp speed over and over and over again for the past 9 months. So thank you for bringing that into the conversation and pointing that out for folks, because it's an important part of staying focused on your purpose, that it doesn't always have to look the same way. And I think if we do a poll and we asked folks, is in-person essential to the function of the church 9 months ago, a large majority of people, if not 100% of people, would have said yes. And now...
I would have voted in that category.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. And yet what we've all learned is how we do it can shift and change, and what opportunities to reach people that we would have never reached before. And the stories that I continue to hear of, spouses that wouldn't attend in-person worship, but are worshiping with their spouse because they're watching it online on Sunday morning, or people who have been homebound and didn't feel that they were connected to the community in the same way are now feeling connected. I mean, there's beautiful stories that come out of that, and it's all connected back to our why. So I'll pause on that and get off my soapbox, and Tim can take us to the to the next thing.
Bill, one of the things we know about leadership and courageous leadership particularly is that it's not done in a vacuum. And it's not done out of relationship. I mean, without relationships. And much of what you've been talking about, you're in relationship either with staff, congregation, or the rest of the world. What have you learned? What characteristics of other leaders make a good partnership with your leadership?
Well, let me start by saying, there's certain leaders that I look up to or I admire based on certain kind of characteristics that they show or have. Like if I'm watching someone, preaching online, or I know somebody that's, leading a church or an organization. And some of those characteristics that resonate really well with me of leaders that I look up to or that I admire are leaders that show persistence. That they just don't give up no matter what goes on. They're keep moving forward, and that kind of goes back to that courageous leadership. Another one for me is consistency. That they're the same, regardless of the situation. When you have leaders that are all over the board, it's really hard to follow them because one day they're here and another day they're somewhere else, and that makes it really difficult. So I love leaders that are consistent in their leadership. I love leaders that are honest and vulnerable, like that they talk about, hey, this is hard and we're going through a tough time, and they're able to share that vulnerability with their people, that they don't just come across as that they have it all together all the time. I love leaders that what I feel like have integrity, like they're the same, regardless of the situation. It's connected to consistency. I also look up to leaders that I feel that are selfless. Like you get a sense that they're not doing it for themselves, but they're really doing it for others. I love leaders that are adaptable, that they can flex, with the situation. Like for me, just a lot of us, and this is just natural, we all did it. When COVID hit, we tried to go back to the things that we knew, and do ministry the way we knew it. And it was really hard to be thinking about, okay, what are some new ways, to do ministry in this context, in this situation. So I found myself gravitating towards those leaders that were being adaptable and changing, how they were doing ministry because the context of ministry changed. I also like leaders that are what I would call calculated risk takers. They take risks, but they do it, with good information and knowing that they're probably going to succeed if they do this. So they take risks, but they do it calculated. And then I think the last thing I would say, and this I think is important to me, especially with young leaders, is I like leaders who lead out a consensus. And I think young people, especially just because of the culture and kind of what they're looking for, they're not looking for autocratic leaders. They're looking for people where it's a team, and there's consensus in the direction. And so for me, that's really important, especially as we're trying to reach younger people for Christ, and we're trying to, connect up. So those are some of the things that I value in a leader.
So
now, go ahead.
Bill, can I interrupt you here for a minute? Listening to the characteristics that you just described, I'm going to tease you a little bit here, because what I kept thinking was, oh, Bill values Jesus being present in leadership. Because all of the qualities that you named are things that we see embodied in Jesus in the scriptures. So you didn't say that at all directly, but I was just listening to what you were saying, and I'm like, yeah, that's Jesus. That's Jesus. Once again, that's Jesus. That's who he is and who he's inviting us to be. So you're consistent.
Well, that's why I appreciate you, because you made that connection that I hadn't made. So yeah, I would say, Jesus is our best leader, right? Obviously.
So I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No. So those are things I admire in a leader, and I look for, like when I'm looking for people that I'm trying to figure out how they're doing things and what I can learn from them. But then I also think as a leader, you have to have people around you that complement your strengths and weaknesses and things. And so, for me, that means that that I find people that are good at things that I'm not good at, or that are maybe have some skill sets or things that I'm not, that I don't have. And that's where, if you really understand your why you're doing it, you don't get paralyzed, or you're not fearful of people who are better than you in certain areas, or even in the area that you think is your own strength. I'm learning that sometimes, I think sometimes we hold on to the thing we think we're good at, but a really good leader, they can recognize somebody that's even better than them at that, and then let them go at it, and so that's where it's the hardest, when it rubs up against the thing you think you're good at, and you find somebody that's even better than you at that. But if you really understand your why, then you have no problem letting that go. So I think that's the power of the why in that. But, other things I think is, for a team, is it's really important that you find team members that value the whole more than the individual part, higher than the individual part. What I mean by that is that you want people, like I want a children's ministry person to be super passionate about children's ministry, and I want them to fight for it, and I want them to, say, hey, I want more in the budget for it and all these things. But at the same time, I also want this children's minister to realize that the whole of the church is still even bigger and more important than their children's ministry piece. So that when they make decisions, they make it for the whole of the church, not just for their ministry area. So I'm looking for people like that. And I think you've got to have a team where people feel like they can have honest and open communication, and they can trust people. You can trust people to express their true feelings. Like if they're really not happy with something, they can tell you that. And so if they're afraid, or it's a culture of fear or intimidation, they're not going to be honest with each other. And that's really important, to have a team around you, a partnership around you, that people can express what they're really thinking and feeling, and not feel fearful of that, and that their input is valued. Like I know, like we just brought on a person who's 26 years old onto our team, and we have her working on our programming team, which is kind of like the executive team of our staff. And when she comes up with ideas, I try to make sure, hey, we give her the credit, and we tell her, hey, this was a great idea, and and we jump on that idea. And that way she feels like her idea is valued, and she's a part of the team. And so I think that's really important, that people understand that their ideas are valued. Now, it doesn't mean that you'll always go with that idea, but they have to understand that their ideas are valued as a part of the process. So those are some things I think, Tim, that are, either characteristics that I've looked at for leaders for myself, or that I've tried to incorporate into a team kind of leadership.
Well, Bill, what I can tell by listening to you, a couple of things. One is, it does make a difference where you start, and you have said that in a number of ways, just not that way, through this conversation, so that purpose or motivation or why is extremely important. And whether it's been 30 years of ministry or just the way God has made you, you've done a tremendous job of developing the leadership gifts and skills that God's given you. And I'm grateful for what you've shared with us today. I just needed to say that.
Well, thank you, Tim.
Yeah, and hearing you walk through that list, I first said, yeah, he's pointing to Jesus. And then on top of that, I went, he's checking off the entire list of what does it mean to be a daring and courageous leader. So thank you for that. We have a couple more questions for you, and I'm wondering if you would be willing to share with our listeners a courageous decision that you're making right now.
So there's several in the midst of what we're dealing with COVID. Probably, the first one was just suspending our in-person worship the first time. We did that in March. I was actually in Minnesota at the time. I was helping another church with a church consultation, and I got this call from our director of operations, and he was telling me, Ohio's closing down and all this kind of stuff. And at first, I didn't even know if we were going to be able to get back from Minnesota on the airline at that point. But I remember having to make this decision to close the church that Sunday. It was on a Wednesday, that Sunday in Minnesota on my phone. So that was kind of hard because I wasn't even around my team, to have that conversation. But I would tell you more recently, when we suspended our worship at the end of November, that was even tougher. And the reason is because we'd been back into in-person worship for a couple months. And I hadn't realized, we'd been out for 6 months. I hadn't realized how much I missed it personally. The first day that I walked across the parking lot when we restarted worship in September, I cried. That first morning, the sun was coming up across the parking lot. It was shining right on the cross on our church. And I just started crying because I was so thankful to be back in worship, with people. And so we did that for 2 months, and every Sunday we would have people that came back for the first time, and they had this really emotional experience about being back in in-person worship. So when we resuspended, when I made that decision for us to resuspend worship in the end of November through Christmas and including our Christmas Eve services, that was even harder because I knew what I was already missing. So that felt like a courageous decision for me, but I knew it was the right decision, for the safety and the health of, our community and loving our community. Another courageous decision is that fundamentally, obviously, the way we do church is changing. And so online worship is not going to go away, especially for the medium to large size churches. We have to do online worship. And so, we've made a shift to invest in live streaming equipment for our church, which we're putting a big investment in. We're looking at about a $50,000 investment, and to be able to go to our board and to say, hey, in the midst of a situation where finances are down and we don't know what they're going to look like in the future, making that investment to what I believe is going to be critical for the future of the church, I felt like a hard and courageous decision, because you're having to, look forward. And even though maybe we don't have the resources, right now, we've got to look forward into the future and make that decision. We also, we made a decision not to create a budget for 2021 yet. And we're, it's in December, when we're having this conversation. Normally we have our budget already put together for 2021. And, I said, I just don't know where we're going financially. I don't know what it looks like. And our expenses are down, our income's down, but our expenses are down. So our cash flow is pretty flat. And so rather than make big decisions about what our budget's going to look like for 2021, we decided to hold off and just say, if we're maintaining our cash flow, then let's not make big decisions about, huge changes in the budget, because we don't know what it's going to look like. And so that's like totally out of the context of the way we've ever done church before, right? Not having a budget for the next year. So, and then the other thing I would tell you is that the last one is we made a decision to focus only on 4 things for our church through this COVID time. And it took me a while to get to this, but we wanted, and it's based out of our why and what we think is important, but we wanted, number one, to be able to connect people to God. And we knew that a primary way for us to do that is through our online worship. And so we wanted to make sure that our online, and when we restarted in person, that it was as good as we could make it for people, that they would have a meaningful, engaging, experience. So our worship and connecting people to God was one priority. A second priority was COVID created this thing where, we're social distance and we're not together. So we talked about how important it is to focus in on our group life, that, whether that's through Zoom or whether in like over the summer groups met, social distance outside, but to help people stay connected with each other was a second one. So connection with God through worship, connection with each other through our group life. And then the third one was we were desperately trying to figure out how we continue the mission of Jesus into the world when, the world's saying, don't touch me, stay away, stay social distance. And so we came up with this idea and we got it through what we watched happen over the summer, where people got out in their neighborhood and they started walking their neighborhoods and they started meeting with their neighbors and connecting with their neighbors. And I thought that's never happened before, in the last 20 years. People haven't done that, but COVID caused them to do that. And so we jumped on this idea that maybe we could empower our church family to see their neighborhood as, their connection and to begin to reach out to their neighbors. And so we've actually created what we call our block mission movement, which is trying to get our church family to connect up and build relationships with their neighbors. And we've given them some resources. Like at Thanksgiving, we gave them a little pumpkin and had a little card on it and just said, hey, we're really grateful that you're our neighbor. We don't have anything that connects it, to the church, because we want the people to be able to connect with their neighbors and say, hey, we're grateful for you, we're thankful for you, we love you, whatever. And so Thanksgiving was a little pumpkin saying we're thankful. Christmas, we put together these little wooden Christmas trees and we put the word hope on it, because what do we need more right now than hope? And so, and there are little yard decorations that they can put in their yard. And so the idea is that they would offer these Christmas trees out. And so each month we're doing something to kind of empower and equip our church family to kind of reach their neighbors. And so that's a way that we've shifted all of our mission and outreach to our neighborhoods, because a lot of the other kinds of mission and outreach that we had been doing, we can't do anymore because of COVID. And then the last thing we did was, when COVID first hit, we made this attempt to contact our whole church family by phone and just let them know we cared about them and, if they had any prayer concerns. Well, as COVID continued, that kind of went away. It was a big thing. We worked really hard at the beginning to make connections with everybody. But then as COVID continued, we stopped. But we realized that we really need to do that. And so we put together a calling team to call our entire church family once every month to 6 weeks to just say, hey, we care about you and we love you. Is there anything you need? And we asked, I think, 23 people to do it, and 21 of them said yes. And I mean, we didn't have to shake the vine to try to find people to do this. And what that said to me is people understood how important this was, that they needed it, that other people needed it. And so they were willing to do it. And so that's what I think where COVID is kind of, helping remind us that you're trying to listen to where God's leading and what the needs of the people are in the community. And then you're trying to line yourself up with that. And for me, it was a great, confirmation that this caring calling ministry was really important, because we had no trouble recruiting people to make the calls. So those are the 4 things that we're focusing on right now. And those are all the kind of courageous decisions I think I've been have to make through this time.
And what a beautiful expression of being the church, staying connected to your why, but how you're doing it has totally shifted. So thank you for that.
Bill, with all the things that you've said, let me ask one other question. What do you celebrate God doing in your life and leadership over the last 3 months?
I would say three things. One, God's helped me learn to depend on Him more through this time than depending on myself. I think that's one of the things COVID has really taught me. I was really, without even knowing it, I was depending a lot on myself. And you just have to depend on God when things get tough. Another one, as a personal one for me, I'm spending time with my mom. My mom came up at the beginning of COVID to stay with us. And my mom's 85 years old. And so I've gotten the past 9 months to be with my mom in a time in my life when I never thought that would ever happen. And so that's been a huge gift that God's given to me. And, just understanding, I think the other thing I would say is that COVID and God's taught me in the last, not even just 3 months, but 9 months, is how different we all are and how we're all processing this differently. And being okay with that with people, to know that people are in different places. Some people are very, paralyzed. Some people are, wanting to move forward, and we're all in a different spot, and that's okay. And just being open to that and thankful for people and where they are and how they're going through it.
And we're celebrating those things right with you. So are you ready for the rapid fire podcast questions? So these are 5 questions meant to simply be quick and help our listeners, not that you haven't already done this, but get to know you in a slightly different way. So The first question is totally out of left field. What's your favorite snack food?
Caramel salted ice cream.
Ooh.
Bill, what do people misunderstand about you?
How I take things very personally.
What is the last thing that you read?
Your questions for this podcast.
Good answer.
What brings you joy these days?
My family.
I'm going to ask this last question in a few different ways. You choose how you want to answer it. What music, that's really the focus, brings you meaning, motivates you, or brings you peace?
What music? Right now, it's the Christmas carols. I realize how important all that is to me, and so those are really, they resonate deep in my heart right now. So.
Well, Bill, thank you. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to share with us a part of your heart and a part of your journey and how you are leading courageously every single day from your why, even when there are curveballs like pandemics thrown at you. So thank you for sharing your heart and your faith and being with us today. I'm grateful.
Well, thank you for your leadership too. I really respect both of you. So it's been an honor to serve alongside of you.
Any last minute words for our listeners that we didn't touch on, but you're thinking, gosh, I wish I would have said?
I would just say, hang in there. God is with us, and God sees it when we can't. And so we just need to keep depending and trusting on Him. And it's not easy. It's hard, but we have somebody who's bigger than all of it. So,
amen. Tim, any last minute words?
Well, I just want to, Bill, thank you for your, I'm going to call it witness today. You've not only modeled for us, but you have given us a good way of looking how to move forward when we feel like we're paralyzed. And it's been very good for me. Thank you.
I trust that what Bill has shared with us today has got you thinking, that maybe you even hit pause a few times to stop and think for yourself about some of the things that he was sharing so that you might live into being the leader that God created you to be. As we've been doing, let me leave you with a few questions to consider to take action on what you've heard in this podcast. The first thing that I'm going to ask you to do is identify a few people in your circle of influence who need to listen to this podcast so that you can have a conversation together about either your collective or your individual why. That's more of a task than it is a question. So here's the questions. How is your why informing every decision that you make? That's question 1. Question 2, what story about leading from your why can you share with others? In other words, how is your why making a difference in your life and your leadership? Then, this is a question that I'd encourage you to ask the people that you are leading. What why or story of your why are other people seeing in your leadership? And then last but not least, yes, I'm giving you a lot of questions for this episode because there was so much in it, I couldn't narrow it just down to a couple. What are you doing as a leader to connect people to your collective why, even as you evaluate how and what you are doing? What are you doing as a leader to connect people to your collective why, even as you evaluate how and what you are doing? Once again, you can find these questions along with show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/podcast. Look for episode 160 or go directly to transformingmission.org/160. And remember, who you are is how you lead. Bye for now.